morning formation at Fort Campbell began at 5:45, and Sergeant James Spears had seen every kind of soldier walk across that gravel yard in 11 years of service. He had seen boys who thought the Army was an adventure. He had seen boys who thought it was an escape. He had seen boys who arrived angry at the world and left even angrier. Boys who came in broken and left pieced together. Boys who discovered something about themselves out on that red Kentucky dirt that they could not have found anywhere else. He thought he had seen every kind. Then Private James Marshall Hendrix arrived on a Tuesday morning in November 1961, and Spears realized he had not seen this kind before. It was not the way Hendrix looked. There were stranger-looking recruits. It was not the way he stood, though he did stand slightly apart from the others, not aggressively, not defiantly, just apart, the way a person stands when they are used to occupying space alone. It was something about his hands. Spears noticed the hands immediately. They were extraordinary hands, long-fingered, almost architectural in their proportions, and Hendrix held them at his sides during formation with a specific kind of stillness that Spears had never seen in a nervous 19-year-old recruit. Most boys fidgeted. Most boys couldn't help themselves. Hendrix stood like someone waiting for something, and his hands were perfectly, unnaturally still. Spears filed this observation away without thinking much about it and moved on to other things. The 101st Airborne Division did not have time for philosophical observations about new recruits. What it had time for was training, and the training at Fort Campbell in 1961 was serious and relentless, and specifically designed to break down whatever a young man had been before he arrived and rebuild him into something the Army could use. Hendrix went through it like all the others. He ran. He drilled. He learned to field strip a rifle in the dark. He did not complain. He did not distinguish himself in any remarkable way during those first weeks. He simply moved through the requirements of each day with a quiet efficiency that Spears initially interpreted as discipline. It took several weeks before Spears understood it was not discipline at all. It was distance. Hendrix was not fully present at Fort Campbell, not in the way the Army needed him to be. He completed every task, but something in him was always slightly elsewhere, as if one part of his attention had been loaned out to some other place and never quite returned. Spears saw it most clearly during the briefings, when the recruits were supposed to be absorbing tactical information. The others leaned forward. They took notes. Hendrix sat with his pencil above his notepad and sometimes wrote nothing for 20 minutes. And when Spears walked behind him and glanced at the page, he found not notes, but small drawings, patterns, repetitive geometric shapes that filled the margins of Army-issue paper. Not doodles exactly, something more deliberate than doodles. Something that looked, if you stared at it long enough, like notation for a language that hadn't been invented yet. Spears took the notepad once, studied it for longer than he intended, put it back. He said nothing about it. The first jump came in December. Hendrix was assigned to the 101st Parachute Training Program, which was not unusual for recruits who showed sufficient physical capability, and Hendrix was physically capable in ways that consistently surprised people who hadn't been watching him carefully. He was not the largest man in his unit. He was not the loudest or the most visibly aggressive, but he had balance, extraordinary balance, and a spatial awareness that the jump instructors noticed almost immediately. Where other men tensed at the door of the aircraft, Hendrix went still. That same particular stillness from the formation yard. Where other men's bodies rebelled against the basic animal wrongness of stepping into empty air, Hendrix stepped. He did not close his eyes. That was what one of the jump instructors, a staff sergeant named Kowalski, mentioned to Spears afterward. Most men close their eyes, Kowalski said. Reflex. Hendrix keeps them open. Looks around like he's trying to see something out there. Spears asked what he meant. Kowalski thought about it for a moment. Like he already knows what it sounds like to fall, he said. Like he's been here before, and he's just checking whether it's the same. This was an odd thing for a jump instructor to say. Kowalski was not a man given to odd observations. Spears noted it and said nothing. Over the following months, Hendrix made 26 jumps. The number itself was not extraordinary. What was extraordinary was what the instructors reported after each one. Not that he was reckless, not that he was careless. The opposite. He was, by every measurable standard, exceptionally skilled. His landings were precise. His body position in free fall was correct. His reaction times on the equipment checks were better than most men with twice his experience. Captain Roland Fletcher, who oversaw the parachute program and had served in Korea and was not a man who handed out praise casually, wrote in an evaluation that Private Hendrix demonstrated a natural aptitude for airborne operations that was among the finest he had observed in a decade of instruction. The evaluation was filed, the commendation was noted, and then something else was noted, because in the Army, aptitude was only one column in a ledger that had many columns, and some of the other columns did not go as well for Private Hendrix. He was late, not always, and not dramatically but consistently, and in a way that suggested the lateness was not carelessness, but rather a fundamental difficulty with the Army's relationship to time. He was late because, Spears eventually discovered, he was elsewhere. Not physically elsewhere, not AWOL, not in town trying to find trouble. Elsewhere in the sense that he would sit somewhere on the base after hours with a piece of wire or a borrowed guitar from another soldier, or sometimes nothing at all, just his hands moving in the air as if running through something, and time would simply pass differently for him than it passed for everyone else. Spears found him once behind the motor pool, sitting on an upturned crate with a cheap acoustic guitar that belonged to a corporal from Tennessee, who had lent it without quite being able to explain why he'd said yes when Hendrix asked. It was 11:30 at night. Formation was at 5:45. The guitar had 3 strings that were slightly out of tune and one that buzzed on every other fret, and Hendrix was playing it in the dark with the focused absorption of a man diffusing something. Spears stood and watched for longer than he should have. He could not have explained afterward what it was, precisely, that stopped him from interrupting immediately. He had interrupted hundreds of soldiers in situations like this without hesitation, because that was what sergeants did. But he stood in the shadows by the motor pool and watched Hendrix play that damaged guitar, and something about it produced in him a feeling he did not have a clean military word for. What he could say later, when he was older and had more language for such things, was that it sounded purposeful, not like someone entertaining himself, like someone working, like someone solving something. The damaged strings and the missing frets were not obstacles. Hendrix moved around them without pausing, finding other paths to the sound he was after, adjusting without breaking stride. It was, Spears would say decades later, like watching someone navigate in a language he had invented himself, and the fluency was complete and total and entirely self-constructed. Eventually, Spears cleared his throat. Hendrix looked up. He did not look guilty. He did not look afraid. He looked like someone being interrupted in the middle of a sentence, mildly inconvenienced, willing to wait. "Put it away," Spears said. Hendrix put it away. "Yes, Sergeant," he said. His voice was quiet. It was always quiet. Spears had noticed from the beginning that Hendrix never raised his voice, not even in situations where raised voices were the norm. He simply pitched his voice at a level that made you lean toward him slightly, and then you had already committed to listening before you had made the conscious decision to. "Get some sleep," Spears said. Hendrix stood, folded the guitar carefully under his arm, and walked back toward the barracks without hurrying. Spears watched him go. Then he stood alone behind the motor pool in the dark for another few minutes, not quite sure what he was waiting for. This was the problem with Private Hendrix, and Spears understood it increasingly clearly as the months passed. It was not that he was a bad soldier. In many specific and measurable ways, he was a very good soldier. The 26 jumps, the evaluation from Captain Fletcher, the physical aptitude scores, these were real. These were documented. But the Army did not want men who were very good at the certain things and quietly, persistently, irreducibly themselves in ways that did not fit the requirements of formation. The Army wanted a specific kind of wholeness. Hendrix offered a different kind of wholeness, and the two kinds did not overlap enough to produce a functional soldier. Captain Fletcher came to the same conclusion, reluctantly, over the course of the following winter. Fletcher was not a man who disliked Hendrix. This was important, and Fletcher was always careful to note it when the subject came up in later years. which it did because the subject eventually became impossible to avoid. He did not dislike him. He did not find him threatening or disruptive in the conventional sense. What he found him was incompatible. An incompatibility in a military unit was its own kind of problem, regardless of the affection involved. The specific incident that precipitated the discharge review came in the spring. It was not dramatic. There was no confrontation, no insubordination, no incident report with raised voices and consequences. What happened was that Hendrix was 40 minutes late to a required briefing because he had been in the recreation room with a guitar, and 3 other soldiers had been late to their own assignments because they had stopped to listen, and one of those soldiers had missed a mandatory equipment inspection entirely because he had lost track of time. And the whole sequence of small disruptions traced back, when Spears mapped it out, to one man sitting in a room playing music that apparently made people forget they had somewhere to be. Spears presented this to Fletcher as neutrally as he could. Fletcher read the report. He read it again. He looked out the window of his office at the gravel yard where he had watched Hendrix land from his 26th jump 6 weeks earlier, precise and easy, like a man who had always known how to fall correctly. "He's wasted here," Fletcher said finally. Spears did not respond. It was not his place to respond to that kind of observation. "That's not a criticism," Fletcher said. "It's a fact. He doesn't belong here. It's not a discipline issue. It's not a conduct issue. He doesn't belong here the way you can put a specific tool in the wrong drawer. And it's still a perfectly good tool. It's just in the wrong place. He belongs somewhere else." The discharge paperwork cited unsuitability for military service, which was a classification broad enough to contain many things and specific enough to mean nothing in particular. Hendrix was given an honorable discharge in June 1962. He was handed his papers on a Tuesday morning, which felt appropriate somehow. A Tuesday the way his arrival had been a Tuesday. Nothing ceremonial about it. Just a day that began a different chapter without announcing itself. Spears walked him to the gate. They did not talk much during the walk. Hendrix carried a duffel bag that seemed too light for everything it was supposed to contain, and he walked with the same particular quality of attention he'd had since the first formation, present and not quite present simultaneously. At the gate, Hendrix set down the duffel and extended his hand. Spears shook it. The hand was exactly as extraordinary as he had noticed on that first morning. He noticed it again and said nothing about it. "Good luck," Spears said. "Thank you, Sergeant," Hendrix said. He picked up the duffel and walked through the gate without looking back. Spears stood at the gate for a moment. Then he turned and walked back toward the gravel yard. He did not think about it much over the following years. He was busy. The Army had many requirements, and fulfilling them left limited space for thinking about soldiers who had come and gone. Hendrix became, over time, simply one entry in a ledger of entries, a name associated with certain specific qualities: good jumper, bad timekeeper, extraordinary hands, placed in the drawer marked unsuitable and mostly left there. It was his daughter who made him look again, sometime in 1968. She was 16 and she played his copy of "Are You Experienced" on the kitchen record player with the volume turned up in the way that 16-year-olds turn volumes up, and Spears walked in from the other room intending to tell her to turn it down, and instead stood in the doorway and listened. He did not turn it down. He listened to the whole side. Then he walked to the record player and looked at the sleeve and looked at the face on the sleeve. And the face was different now. Different clothes, different context. The photograph taken in a different world than Fort Campbell's gravel yard. But the hands that held the guitar on the sleeve were exactly as he remembered them. Long-fingered, architectural, extraordinary. He was late to everything because he was doing this somewhere, Spears thought. He stood at the window in his kitchen and thought it again. He was behind the motor pool at 11:30 at night, and he was making this. On 3 strings and a buzzing fret and whatever else he could find, he was already making this, and we were writing it down in a column as a deficiency. He did not say this to anyone for a long time. He was not a man who said things like this easily, and besides, who would he have said it to? It was not the kind of observation that had a natural recipient. He kept it for years, turned it over occasionally, and let it sit. In 1970, when the news came through, he was stationed at a different post, and he heard it the way most people heard it, through someone else who had heard it from someone else. He sat with it for an evening, and then he found in a filing cabinet he had kept through several moves and 2 duty stations the evaluation copy that Captain Fletcher had written in 1962. The one that said Private Hendrix demonstrated a natural aptitude for airborne operations that was among the finest he had observed in a decade of instruction. He read it twice. He thought about the 26 jumps, the open eyes in free fall, what Kowalski had said about how Hendrix looked out at the air like he was checking something. Like he already knew what it sounded like to fall, and he was just verifying. He thought about this for a long time, but he had seen Hendrix step out of an aircraft door at altitude and keep his eyes open while the world sorted itself into its components of sky and earth and falling body. And he had stood behind a motor pool at night listening to 3 strings being asked to become an entire language. And he understood, standing alone in his quarters in 1970 with the evaluation in his hand, that the Army's word for what Hendrix had was not the right word. The right word was not aptitude. He put the evaluation away. He poured himself a drink he didn't particularly need and sat with it untouched and thought about what it meant to be unsuitable. What the word actually meant when you stripped the institutional language off it and held the bare fact up to the light. Unsuitable meant the wrong drawer. It meant a tool that was real and specific and very good, placed somewhere that couldn't use it correctly. He had thought it was a waste for the Army, Spears said later, when he finally did say it, to an interviewer who came looking for anyone who had known Hendrix before the world knew him. He had written it off as a loss for the 101st Airborne. What it was actually was a loss that ran in the other direction. 30 seconds of that record playing in his kitchen, and he understood that the Army had not lost a serviceable soldier. The Army had simply failed to hold on to something it was never going to be able to hold. You can't keep a specific kind of fire in a regulation box and expect the box to come out undamaged. One of them was always going to give. He paused. In this case, he said, I'm glad it was us.